Now, at 83 years old, Smokey Robinson is finished holding back. The man whose falsetto carried a generation of love songs, whose pen shaped the identity of Motown, has guarded certain truths for decades. Behind the velvet voice and polished smiles lived the weight of compromises, betrayals, and sacrifices that built the empire we still celebrate today. For years, Smokey promised himself some stories would remain locked away, but a rediscovered tape, a forgotten contract, and the faces of friends long gone have convinced him that silence no longer honors his past. What happened in those closed-door sessions at Hitsville, USA? Why did Smokey nearly walk away at the height of Motown's glory? And what secrets did Berry Gordy once warn him never to repeat? At 83, the answers are finally here. Long before the Legends, before the Temptations' harmonies, or Diana Ross's rise, before the Supremes became a cultural force, Smokey Robinson was simply William Robinson Jr., a skinny kid from Detroit with mismatched dreams. His father worked long hours hauling concrete. His mother passed away when Smokey was 10, and his older sister raised him with discipline forged in hardship. There were no silver spoons, only scratchy records on a neighbor's phonograph, and a boy who scribbled rhymes into school notebooks, convinced that words could be his way out. As a teenager, he gathered a group of friends and called them the Five Chimes, later the Matadors. They rehearsed in living rooms and stairwells, wherever the echo made their harmonies sound larger than life. Smokey wasn't just their lead singer, he was their songwriter, carrying around notebooks crammed with verses. He devoured records by Clyde McPhatter and Nolan Strong, but more than imitation, he was studying structure, learning how words could climb scales and fall like confessions. By the time the group became the Miracles, Smokey had written more than 100 songs, none of which had seen daylight beyond Detroit's street corners. He believed, stubbornly, that one of them could change everything. The break came in 1957, when fate disguised itself as disappointment. The Miracles auditioned for Jackie Wilson's manager. They sang their hearts out, but the man dismissed them with a shrug. Smokey, crushed, nearly walked out, but Berry Gordy, who was writing songs for Wilson at the time, pulled him aside. Gordy asked to see Smokey's notebook, flipping through pages of carefully written lyrics. The older man saw something the others hadn't: raw talent, undisciplined but undeniable. Gordy told Smokey that most of the songs were terrible, but a few lines were pure gold. That moment forged a bond that would alter American music forever. Together, they sharpened each other. Gordy taught Smokey the business, how to cut the fat from a song, how to repeat a hook until it burrowed into memory. Smokey, in turn, became Gordy's proof that Motown could be more than a dream. When the Miracles released Shop Around in 1960, it sold over 1 million copies, Motown's first to do so. Smokey wasn't just singing now, he was shaping the label's destiny. His pen gave voice to the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye. Quietly, Smokey became Motown's secret weapon, writing songs that defined the sound of young America. But with every hit came new burdens, and not all of them could be sung away. Behind the applause and chart-topping singles, Smokey was learning that Motown's polished surface hid shadows. Contracts chained artists, feuds brewed between acts, uncredited musicians poured their souls into records but never saw recognition. Smokey was Berry Gordy's confidant, his right hand, but also his shield. When tempers flared, Smokey smoothed them. When rumors swirled about money, Smokey deflected them. He was more than an artist. He was Motown's diplomat, yet even he began to wonder how much of himself he was sacrificing to keep the machine turning. The deeper Smokey went, the more he saw the other side of success. Some artists discovered that their contracts left them nearly penniless despite sold-out tours. Musicians who laid down unforgettable bass lines and horn blasts, the Funk Brothers, were rarely credited. Smokey believed in Gordy's vision of a black-owned label competing with giants, but he also knew compromises were being made in the shadows. There were arguments, slammed doors, and moments when Smokey wondered if they were creating history or simply selling their souls, note by note. One night in the late 60s, after a grueling recording session, Smokey sat in his car long after the engine turned over. He was exhausted, not from the singing, but from the pretending. Was he still writing from the heart, or was he writing to keep the machine alive? He had once promised himself he would never become a cog in anyone's system. Now he feared he already was. The moment of reckoning came quietly. In 1969, with the world shifting, Vietnam on the news, civil rights battles in the streets, Detroit scarred from riots, Smokey confessed to Claudette that he was thinking of quitting, not just leaving the Miracles, but walking away from music entirely. He had given his 20s to Motown, poured out lyrics until his notebooks ran dry, lived in service to Berry Gordy's dream, but he wasn't sure who William Robinson Jr. was anymore. Claudette listened, knowing the toll it had taken, and asked him the question that haunted him for years. If you walk away now, will you ever forgive yourself? That question lingered as Smokey weighed the cost of staying against the emptiness of leaving. Motown was bigger than ever, but Smokey felt like he was shrinking inside it. The crowd still screamed, the records still sold, yet the man who once sang about tears now found them coming when nobody was watching. At the height of his fame, Smokey Robinson, the poet laureate of Motown, nearly vanished from the stage forever. When Smokey Robinson finally stepped away in the early 70s, it wasn't out of bitterness, but survival. He announced his retirement in 1972, intent on spending more time with his family. For a moment, it seemed like the story would end there, the voice of Motown silenced by exhaustion. But history rarely lets go so easily, and neither did Smokey. What pulled him back was not ambition, but memory. He began revisiting the songs he had written in his earliest days, the notebooks that still lay in drawers and boxes. Many were unfinished sketches, fragments of melodies. Yet, in those forgotten pages, Smokey rediscovered himself. The words were raw, unpolished, free from commercial pressure. They reminded him of the boy who scribbled verses on school paper, who sang on stairwells without thinking of record deals or royalties. It was as if his younger self had left him a map back to the reason he had started singing in the first place. But memory was not the only force drawing him back. In 1972, Motown relocated to Los Angeles, leaving behind its Detroit roots, and the transition was not smooth. Some artists struggled, others left, and Berry Gordy needed someone he trusted to stabilize the ship. Smokey was that person. Though he had retired from performing, he could not escape the call of responsibility. When friends pleaded with him to return, when Gordy insisted his voice was still needed, Smokey found himself drawn back into the orbit he had tried to escape. Yet this time, the cost would be different. Smokey returned not as the lead singer of the Miracles, but as a solo artist, stepping into a new identity that was both liberating and frightening. In 1973, he released his first solo album. Critics were cautious, unsure if the man who had thrived within a group and written for others could stand alone. Smokey proved them wrong. His voice remained ageless, tender, yet commanding, a reminder that time could not dull the gift he carried. But success as a solo artist did not erase the shadows of Motown. In fact, stepping forward on his own forced Smokey to reckon with the years he had left behind. During this period, Smokey began to revisit the archives, both physical and personal. There were recordings in Motown's vaults, alternate takes, unreleased songs, scraps of genius left in the margins. Listening to them, Smokey realized how much of himself he had poured into the label, how many late nights and uncredited contributions still echoed in the grooves. He had written over 4,000 songs, and many had never seen daylight. The truth of Motown wasn't just in the hits the world knew, but in the forgotten artifacts locked in those vaults. Smokey kept copies of some lyrics, his own handwritten notes, pages that bore witness to his tireless work. It was in those rediscovered notes that Smokey began to see his life in full view. He realized that walking away completely would not only silence his voice, but bury the stories of a generation that had built Motown from scratch. He had seen how many voices were already lost, young artists who burned bright and faded quickly, session musicians who died without recognition, colleagues who were rewritten out of the label's glossy history. Smokey understood then that his survival meant responsibility. If he didn't tell the truth, who would? And so, he began writing again, not just songs but reflections, quiet letters to himself, journals that chronicled the pressures, the victories, the betrayals, and the love that had defined his career. They weren't meant for immediate release, but Smokey knew that someday they would matter. Because Motown wasn't just a label, it was a kingdom built on both melody and silence. To preserve only the melody would be a lie. The catalyst came in the form of a recording session in the late 70s when Smokey penned Cruisin'. It was sensual, patient, unlike anything he had written before. The song became a massive success, not because it followed a formula, but because it came from the same place as his earliest scribbles in Detroit: personal, unguarded, true. It was proof to Smokey that he could still make music that transcended the machine, that his voice still belonged not to contracts, but to himself. That track reignited his belief in the power of telling his story through song. But even with that renewal, Smokey could not ignore the ghosts of Motown. He had watched colleagues like Marvin Gaye battle demons until tragedy struck, seen the Supremes splinter, witnessed friends turn into enemies under the weight of success. Each loss reminded him that silence was not protection, it was erasure. As he entered his 50s, Smokey resolved that one day, when the time was right, he would tell it all. For now, he kept it in notebooks and memory, but the decision had been made. He would not leave this earth without breaking the silence. By the time Smokey Robinson entered his 60s, the shadows of Motown had grown heavier. The glossy narrative told to the public was one of unbroken triumph, a label that launched superstars and changed American music forever. But Smokey had lived inside those walls, and he knew the truth was more complicated. For every star who soared, there were others whose wings had been clipped. For every success story on magazine covers, there were quieter tragedies that never reached the public ear. Smokey had witnessed it all, and the older he became, the more those memories pressed on him. He remembered the Funk Brothers, the studio band whose hands gave life to every hit, but whose names rarely appeared on records. They played until their fingers bled, crafted arrangements that made the world dance, yet most of them died in obscurity, their contributions buried beneath the shine of Motown's branding. Smokey never forgot that without them, the songs would have been skeletons. He thought about Florence Ballard, the founding Supreme. She left the group in 1967 and never found her way back. Smokey never forgot her final years, struggling with poverty and heartbreak, dying at just 32. To the world, she was a footnote. To Smokey, she was a reminder of how ruthless the system could be, how quickly brilliance could be erased when it no longer served the machine. Then there was Marvin Gaye, his brother in artistry and in pain. Smokey had watched Marvin fight for What's Going On, resisted by Motown executives who thought it too political. When Marvin died in 1984, shot by his own father, Smokey mourned not just a friend, but a casualty of the pressures they had all endured. Behind the glamour, Motown's artists were flesh and blood, carrying burdens the audience never saw. The pattern extended beyond individuals. Smokey saw how the label sometimes pitted artists against each other, stoking rivalries to push performances higher. He heard the whispers about finances, about contracts that tied singers to endless obligations. Even Berry Gordy, whom Smokey loved like family, was not without fault. Gordy was a visionary, but he was also a businessman who made decisions that left scars. Smokey never denied Gordy's genius, but he also never forgot the cost at which that genius was maintained. And the women of Motown, Smokey could never forget them. Diana Ross had climbed to heights few could imagine, but the climb was not gentle. Smokey remembered the resentment from peers, the pressure placed on her shoulders, the isolation that came with being chosen as Gordy's favorite. Other women faced different fates. Mary Wells, the first female star of Motown who had once ruled the charts with My Guy, left the label at her peak and never regained her footing. Smokey had written for her, celebrated her rise, and mourned her fall. He knew how quickly a woman's voice could be lifted to the heavens and then cast aside when the machine no longer needed her. All of it formed a mosaic Smokey could not ignore. Motown was not simply a fairy tale. It was a kingdom built on brilliance and sacrifice, on dreams fulfilled and dreams destroyed. Smokey's own survival often felt like luck, as though his voice had shielded him where others had not been spared. He carried survivor's guilt, though he rarely spoke of it. Why had he endured when so many around him had faded, fallen, or been erased? The answer, he realized, was that someone had to endure. Someone had to live long enough to remember, to speak, to bear witness. As the years passed, Smokey began weaving those memories into interviews, dropping hints in conversations, testing the waters of honesty. He did not speak with anger, but with gravity, knowing that the truth would one day matter more than the myth. He recalled telling one journalist, almost offhand, that the hardest part of Motown was not the work, but the weight of silence. Few noticed at the time, but those who listened closely understood that Smokey was preparing himself and the world for a fuller accounting. Motown had given him everything: fame, fortune, immortality through song. But it had also taken, and it had taken deeply. As Smokey entered his 70s, he knew the day was coming when he would have to open the box he had kept shut for decades, because the pattern was too clear, the history too fragile. If he remained silent, the truth would vanish with him. And Smokey Robinson, the poet of Motown, could not let that happen. Now at 83, Smokey Robinson no longer speaks with hesitation. The years have stripped away the need for diplomacy, and the weight of silence has grown heavier than the cost of truth. In rare interviews and reflections, he has begun to describe the full measure of Motown, not just the triumphs, but the fractures. He speaks with tenderness for Berry Gordy, the man who gave him opportunity, but he does not disguise the harsh realities that came with that opportunity. He acknowledges the contracts that bound young artists, the pressures that bent them until they broke, and the uncredited labor that sustained the machine. At 83, Smokey has nothing left to prove. What remains is the need to tell it as it was. He remembers Hitsville, USA, not only as a place of joy, but as a pressure cooker where dreams were born and sometimes crushed in the same week. He talks of the endless hours, the fatigue that clung like smoke, the constant demand to deliver another hit. Yet he also smiles when he recalls the laughter, the camaraderie, the way music stitched them together like family even when family ties frayed. For Smokey, Motown was never one thing. It was a paradox, both a sanctuary and a cage, a stage of miracles and a house of ghosts. To pretend otherwise, he insists now, would be dishonest. And so he tells the stories. He remembers Marvin's defiance, Florence's heartbreak, the Funk Brothers' brilliance, Diana's struggles, Mary Wells' flight. He recalls the nights when Motown's artists looked at one another not as rivals but as survivors, holding each other up against an industry that demanded everything and gave little back. These are not tales told for pity, but for clarity. Smokey knows that legacies built only on shine are fragile. It is the cracks, the scars, the moments of doubt that make the story endure. The turning point for his voice came not in a concert hall, but in his own living room, when he sat surrounded by letters, journals, and half-faded lyric sheets. They were not souvenirs, they were records. Each page bore witness to nights of exhaustion, mornings of inspiration, and the compromises he had once sworn never to make. Reading them again in his 80s, Smokey felt both sorrow and relief. Sorrow for what had been lost, but relief that he had lived long enough to tell it without fear. He understood then that his story was not only his own, it belonged to every musician who never had the chance to speak. As he speaks now, younger artists listen with reverence. They know his songs, but they are only beginning to grasp the history behind them. Some approach him with gratitude, thanking him not just for the music, but for the honesty he finally shares. Smokey accepts their thanks with humility, but he also offers a warning. Fame, he tells them, can be a velvet trap. Success can demand silence, and the cost of staying quiet is often higher than the cost of speaking out. It is a message carved from a lifetime inside Motown's walls, delivered by a man who survived them. When Smokey steps on stage these days, the movement is slower, the notes softer, but the fire remains. He looks out at crowds who still rise to their feet, and he knows the applause is not only for the music, but for endurance. Few of his peers are left, and fewer still with voices intact. Smokey Robinson, against odds and expectations, has endured. That endurance is no longer a secret. It is his final act of defiance. And when he is asked what he would say to Motown now, to the empire that shaped him and scarred him in equal measure, Smokey answers with quiet strength, "You gave me the world. You also took pieces of it away. But I am still here, and I am still singing." It is not bitterness that colors his words, but truth. At 83, truth is the only song worth singing. The Motown sound has echoed across 6 decades, carried by radio waves, pressed into vinyl, streamed into invisible clouds. But behind every note was a man who bore witness to it all, a man who refused to be erased, who outlived the myths, who now speaks so that others will not be forgotten. Smokey Robinson is not just Motown's voice, he is its survivor. And no matter how many glossy documentaries are released, how many anniversary specials are staged, or how many tributes are choreographed, there will always be a song Smokey sings that no one else can control, the Song of Truth. And in that truth lies his final legacy, not just the falsetto that melted generations, not just the lyrics that turned heartache into poetry, but the courage, at 83, to finally open the door that had stayed closed for too long. Smokey Robinson, the poet laureate of Motown, has given the world his last and most necessary verse, the story of what it truly cost to build an empire of sound.